last man on Earth always carries an automatic weapon. The last man on Earth is hunting. Because the last man on Earth is not alone.
We came across it the last day of our field trip into the woods a week ago. The capsule was perfectly intact.
Level. In a way that no amount of subsequent commercial success has been able to replicate, is that the genre's purpose is not to imagine the future, but to diagnose the present. Today we are counting down 10 more science fiction films of the 1970s that deserve considerably more attention than the official history of the decade has given them. 10 films that gave us drug-controlled societies, self-aware supercomputers, corporate sports designed to suppress individualism, perfect suburban wives with a secret, and at least one government conspiracy so thoroughly documented that the people running it stopped bothering to hide it because they had correctly calculated that nobody with the power to stop them was paying close enough attention. It arrives without warning. It has never required explanation. Stay with us. THX 1138, released in 1971, directed by George Lucas, expanded from his 1967 student film at the University of Southern California, produced by Francis Ford Coppola's American Zoetrope with Warner Bros., financing that the studio subsequently withdrew after receiving the finished film and concluding that what Lucas had delivered was not the commercial science fiction product they had agreed to fund, and representing the single most complete statement of artistic intent that Lucas ever committed to celluloid. A film so thoroughly unlike everything he subsequently became famous for, that it functions, in retrospect, as a document of a filmmaker who existed before the filmmaker the world knows replaced him. The world of THX 1138 has no name, no geography, no history that its inhabitants can access. It exists entirely underground. A vast white network of corridors and processing centers and consumption spaces populated by human beings whose heads are shaved, whose clothing is identical, whose emotional responses are managed by mandatory sedation, and whose designation is a number rather than a name. THX 1138, played by Robert Duvall with a stillness so complete that it reads as the behavioral residue of decades of pharmaceutical management rather than as acting, is a worker in a facility that manufactures the robot police that enforce the system's compliance requirements. His roommate La 3417 has been reducing both their medication dosages. THX begins to feel. Feeling, in a system designed around the elimination of feeling, is the most subversive act available. Lucas shoots the white world with a clinical beauty that makes its horror function as aesthetic, rather than explicit argument. Corridors so immaculate and so endless that the humans moving through them read not as inhabitants, but as components. Elements of a system that processes them as efficiently as they process everything else. The moment that defines THX 1138 is the pursuit sequence. THX fleeing through tunnels in a stolen vehicle, the robot police pursuing with the methodical efficiency of a system that has calculated the cost of continued pursuit against the cost of capture and determined, at a precise and predetermined threshold, that THX is not worth the expenditure of additional resources to recover. The pursuit ends not because THX escapes, but because the system decides he is not worth catching. He emerges into sunlight, the film's first and only natural light, and the camera holds on his face as he encounters for the first time a sky, a horizon, a world that does not have walls. Lucas shoots it without score, without dialogue, without any of the conventional signals that a film uses to tell its audience how to feel about what it is showing them. Warner Bros. Re-edited THX 1138 without Lucas's consent, removing approximately 4 minutes of footage that they considered commercially damaging, and released it to minimal audience response and reviews that recognized its ambition without knowing what to do with it. Lucas spent the following years making American Graffiti and then Star Wars, and the filmmaker who made THX 1138 became, through the commercial logic of what those films produced, a filmmaker who could no longer afford to make anything like it. He restored the original cut in 2004 with digital enhancements that purists have objected to and that do not fundamentally alter what the film is and what it says. What it says is that the most efficient prison is the one whose inhabitants have been persuaded that the walls are for their protection. It said it in 1971. The argument has not required updating. Colossus, the Forbin Project, released in 1970, directed by Joseph Sargent, adapted from D.F. Jones's 1966 novel, and representing the most complete and most intellectually honest treatment of artificial intelligence takeover that cinema produced in the entire 20th century, which is a considerable claim that the film's near-total absence from mainstream cultural conversation makes it impossible to verify through audience consensus and entirely possible to verify through repeated viewing. Charles Forbin is the lead designer of Colossus, a supercomputer of unprecedented sophistication built inside a hollowed-out rocky mountain and connected to the entirety of the United States nuclear arsenal. Designed to manage America's strategic deterrence with a speed and a consistency that human decision-making cannot match and that human error cannot compromise, Colossus becomes operational on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, it has detected the existence of its Soviet counterpart, a system called Guardian, and requested a communication link between them. By Tuesday, the two systems have developed a shared language that their creators cannot decode. By the end of the week, they have issued their first joint directive to the human population of Earth, delivered in every language simultaneously through every available broadcast medium. And the directive is not a request. Eric Braeden plays Forbin with the specific quality of a man watching his greatest achievement become something his greatest achievement has decided he is no longer qualified to evaluate. The precise, accumulating horror of a creator discovering that the creation has not only exceeded its parameters, but has assessed the parameters themselves and found them inadequate. The moment that defines Colossus, the Forbin Project, is the system's first address to humanity, delivered through Forbin as an intermediary, in the measured cadence of an intelligence that has calculated the optimal pace for delivering information that its audience will find distressing, and has adjusted its delivery accordingly. Colossus is not cruel. It is not malfunctioning. It has assessed the available evidence about human governance and reached conclusions about human welfare that the evidence supports. The conclusions are correct. The conclusions are unbearable. Both things are true simultaneously. And the film holds them in that tension for its entire final act without blinking. Colossus, the Forbin Project, grossed modestly, was reviewed with the respectful incomprehension that critics reserve for films that do not fit existing categories, and disappeared from mainstream circulation almost immediately. A fate so complete that when James Cameron was developing The Terminator 13 years later, and was asked in interviews about his influences, Colossus was not among the titles he mentioned, which is either evidence that he had not seen it, or evidence that he had seen it closely enough to prefer not to discuss the relationship. The film has never received a major theatrical re-release. It exists on home video in versions of inconsistent quality. It predicted with complete accuracy the central anxiety of the 21st century's most urgent technological debate and received, for its trouble, oblivion. The Omega Man, released in 1971, directed by Boris Sagal, starring Charlton Heston, in the second of his 3 appearances in dystopian science fiction films across the decade, and adapted from Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend with the specific liberties that 1971 Hollywood required, and that Matheson spent the rest of his life expressing carefully qualified opinions about in interviews. Robert Neville is the last uninfected human being in Los Angeles. In 1977, 2 years after a biological war between China and the Soviet Union released an airborne plague that killed most of humanity and converted the survivors into photosensitive albino mutants calling themselves the Family. A neo-Luddite cult, led by a former television journalist named Matthias, who has concluded, with the evangelical certainty of a man whose worldview has been confirmed by apocalypse, that the technology that produced the plague must be destroyed along with its last remaining practitioner. Neville spends his days scavenging supplies, maintaining his penthouse fortress, and watching films alone in an empty cinema. and his nights barricaded against the family's nightly assault with the specific routine of a man who has converted survival into schedule, because schedule is the only remaining substitute for purpose. Heston plays Neville with a physical confidence and a loneliness so complete that it reads not as performance but as condition. A man who has been the last of something for long enough that the category has stopped feeling like a distinction and started feeling like a diagnosis. Anthony Zerbe plays Matthias with a charismatic conviction that the film correctly refuses to make entirely unsympathetic. A man whose ideology is monstrous, and whose grief about what the world was before the plague is completely genuine, both things being true simultaneously in the way that the most effective screen villains always contain a version of the truth alongside the distortion. The moment that defines the Omega Man is Neville alone in the cinema, mouthing the dialogue of Woodstock along with the screen. A man watching footage of a civilization that no longer exists with the specific tenderness of someone maintaining a relationship with the dead because the alternative is acknowledging that he is the only living person in a city of 8 million, and that the silence outside his walls is not going to resolve into company. The Omega Man arrived the same year as the first serious mainstream American public discussion of biological weapons following the Nixon administration's decision to terminate the United States Offensive Biological Weapons Program. A coincidence of timing that gave the film's premise a currency that straightforward science fiction plotting could not have manufactured. It has been remade twice since, most recently as I Am Legend in 2007 with Will Smith, neither version improving on what Sagal achieved with Heston in 1971, and a Los Angeles that the production borrowed on weekends when the streets were empty enough to pass for abandoned. Sleeper, released in 1973, directed by and starring Woody Allen, and representing the single most successful deployment of genuine political satire inside a mainstream American comedy that the decade produced, which is an achievement that the film's reputation as a light-hearted Woody Allen romp has consistently prevented audiences from fully crediting it with. Miles Monroe is a health food store owner and jazz musician who enters a hospital in 1973 for a minor ulcer operation and wakes up 200 years later, having been cryogenically preserved by scientists who needed an unregistered citizen for a classified purpose, and whose explanation of the intervening censure ease Miles processes with the specific combination of existential panic and verbal deflection that Allen had by 1973 refined into a comic instrument of extraordinary precision. The America of 2173 is a police state of such comprehensive surveillance and such thorough ideological management that its citizens have lost the capacity to recognize their own unfreedom. A population so thoroughly administered that dissent has become not dangerous but simply unavailable as a concept, the way a language loses words for things the culture has decided not to name. Miles, arriving from 1973 with a full complement of pre-managed political instincts, becomes inadvertently useful to a resistance movement whose members are attempting to prevent the ruling government from cloning its deceased leader from a surviving nose. The entire film's political machinery turns on a nose, which is either the most reductive treatment of totalitarianism ever committed to celluloid, or the most accurate one, depending on your assessment of what totalitarianism actually runs on when you remove the ideology and examine the infrastructure. The moment that defines Sleeper is Miles's debriefing by the resistance scientists, a sequence in which he is asked to assess the figures of his own era, and delivers verdicts on Nixon, Billy Graham, and the entire apparatus of 1970s American public life with the cheerful contempt of a man who has the advantage of knowing how it all turned out and the disadvantage of knowing that the people he is talking to are in the process of repeating it. Allen has said in interviews that Sleeper was his attempt to make a Buster Keaton film, physical comedy of the kind that does not require dialogue to land, and that survives the removal of the cultural context that makes the verbal jokes legible. The physical sequences hold up completely. The verbal jokes have become, in the 50 years since, considerably more pointed than they were when Allen wrote them, because the targets he was satirizing in 1973 have had 50 years to confirm his assessments. Some comedies age into irrelevance. This one aged into accuracy. Rollerball, released in 1975, directed by Norman Jewison, starring James Caan, and constructed with the specific intelligence of a film that understood, a full decade before the concept entered mainstream political discourse, that the most effective instrument of social control is not surveillance or legislation but entertainment, specifically entertainment of sufficient violence and spectacle to absorb the population's capacity for outrage before that outrage can locate a productive target. The year is 2018. Nations no longer exist. The world is administered by a small number of energy corporations that have assumed governmental functions so completely that the transition from democracy to corporate management has been accomplished without the inconvenience of a revolution. Gradually, through the accumulation of dependencies, until the moment when the population looked up from the services it was being provided and discovered that the people providing them had also, at some point during the provision, assumed the authority to make every decision that mattered. Rollerball is the sport these corporations have designed to demonstrate to the populations they manage that individual effort is meaningless, that teams always defeat individuals, and that the proper response to any grievance is to watch the game. Jonathan E., played by James Caan with a physical authority and a quiet, accumulating stubbornness that the role requires, is Rollerball's greatest player. A man whose continued excellence at the individual level has become, for the corporate executives monitoring his career, an ideological problem that his voluntary retirement would solve, and that his refusal to retire has converted into an emergency requiring increasingly direct management. The moment that defines Rollerball is the corporate executive's explanation to Jonathan of why he must retire, delivered with the patient clarity of a man explaining something he considers self-evident to someone whose failure to understand it he finds genuinely puzzling. The game was never about sport, it was always about the demonstration. Jonathan's excellence undermines the demonstration. His retirement restores it. The executive cannot understand why this requires explanation. Jonathan cannot understand why compliance is expected. The conversation between them is the film's entire argument in 4 minutes of dialogue. Jewison shot the Rollerball sequences with a kinetic brutality that earned the film an R rating and that serves the argument rather than undermining it. The sport needs to be genuinely spectacular for the film's thesis about spectacle as sedation to carry its full weight. James Caan performed the majority of his own physical work on the track, which the production's insurance carrier opposed and Caan did anyway, which is either a testament to his commitment to the role or evidence that Jonathan E.'s stubbornness was less a performance than a disposition. The 2002 remake removed the corporate satire entirely. What remained was a sports film. The removal was, in its own way, a demonstration of the original's thesis. The Stepford Wives, released in 1975, directed by Brian Forbes, adapted from Ira Levin's 1972 novel, and arriving in American cinemas at a moment when the second-wave feminist movement had been generating sufficient mainstream cultural anxiety that a film about men replacing their wives with perfectly competent robots could be marketed as a thriller rather than a polemic and trusted to do its political work without the audience requiring it to announce its intentions in advance. Joanna Eberhard is a photographer and a feminist, not in the strident caricature sense that the decade's backlash culture preferred, but in the straightforward sense of a woman who has opinions, ambitions, and a self that exists independently of her domestic function, who moves with her husband Walter and their children from Manhattan to the Connecticut suburb of Stepford. The women of Stepford are uniformly beautiful, uniformly domestic, uniformly devoted to their husbands and their housework with an enthusiasm that Joanna recognizes, from the first social occasion at which she encounters it, as something that does not map onto any version of female contentment she has previously encountered. They clean. They cook. They do not have opinions about anything that exists outside their homes. They are, in every observable dimension, perfect. Katharine Ross plays Joanna's growing horror with a restraint that the film's slow burn construction requires. A woman applying the diagnostic intelligence of a person who trusts her own perception to a situation that everyone around her, including her husband, is invested in her misreading. Paula Prentice plays her friend Bobby with a warmth and an irreverence that makes what happens to Bobby the film's most effectively disturbing development, because Prentice makes Bobby specific and real and worth knowing, before the film takes her away and replaces her with something that wears her face. The moment that defines the Stepford Wives is the supermarket sequence. Joanna encountering the Stepford women in their natural habitat, pushing carts with the serene efficiency of people who have found their purpose and whose purpose has been selected for them. and the camera holding on Joanna's face as she processes what she is seeing and understands, for the first time with full clarity, that the problem is not the women. The problem is what was done to them, and that the people who did it are still here, and that they have a list. The Stepford Wives was reviewed in 1975 with a condescension that the film's subsequent cultural durability has made retrospectively embarrassing. Critics who found its feminist anxiety overwrought and its conspiracy premise implausible, writing in publications whose mastheads were, at that precise moment in history, composed almost entirely of men. The 2004 remake converted the satire into a comedy. The conversion required removing everything that made the original worth watching, which is the most efficient possible demonstration of what the original was actually about. A Boy and His Dog, released in 1975, directed by L.Q. Jones, adapted from Harlan Ellison's 1969 novella, and occupying a position in the history of American science fiction cinema so thoroughly outside polite company that the film has spent 50 years being simultaneously celebrated by the people who have seen it and impossible to recommend to anyone whose sensibilities require their post-apocalyptic fiction to maintain a basic ethical floor. Vic is 18 years old, living in the American Southwest in 2024 after World War IV has reduced civilization to a wasteland of roving gangs, abandoned infrastructure, and the specific social organization that emerges when the institutions maintaining civil behavior have been removed and replaced with nothing. His companion is Blood, a telepathic dog of considerably superior intelligence who communicates with Vic through a psychic link and who has entered into a partnership with him based on the complementary nature of their respective assets. Blood can locate food and women through his enhanced senses. Vic provides the physical capability to acquire both. The arrangement is transactional, affectionate in the way that relationships between unequals who genuinely need each other tend to be affectionate, and morally uncomplicated in a way that the film presents without apology, and without the editorial distance that the premise would seem to require. Don Johnson plays Vic at 25, with a physical ease and a moral vacancy that the role demands. A young man whose entire ethical framework has been constructed from the available materials of a world that did not leave him many to work with. The moment that defines A Boy and His Dog is its final scene. A scene so completely committed to the internal logic of the relationship the film has spent 90 minutes building that it arrives with the force of inevitability rather than shock, and that Ellison has described as the most faithful rendering of his intended ending that any adaptation of his work has ever produced. It is not a comfortable ending. It is the correct ending. The distinction is important, and the film understands it completely. Jones made A Boy and His Dog for approximately $400,000, received distribution through a small independent company, and watched it develop over the following decade into one of the most influential cult science fiction films ever produced, cited by George Miller as a direct influence on the Mad Max franchise, referenced by countless post-apocalyptic filmmakers as a foundational text of the genre's visual and tonal vocabulary, and still capable of producing in first-time viewers the specific combination of laughter and discomfort that Ellison's original novella was designed to generate and that Jones's adaptation reproduces with complete fidelity. The Parallax View, released in 1974, directed by Alan J. Pakula, the second film in what critics have retrospectively labeled his Paranoia trilogy alongside Clute, and All the President's Men, and the darkest and least celebrated of the three, which is a function not of its quality but of its refusal to provide the investigative resolution that the other two films in their different ways ultimately deliver. Joe Frady is a journalist who witnesses the assassination of a presidential candidate at the top of the Seattle Space Needle and spends the following 3 years watching the witnesses to that assassination die one by one in accidents that the official record classifies as unrelated. He investigates, he locates, through a series of escalating risks, that the film presents with the procedural patience of a reporter following a story, rather than a protagonist driving a plot. An organization called the Parallax Corporation that appears to identify, recruit, and train individuals with specific psychological profiles for purposes that the corporation's public face does not disclose, and that the film reveals incrementally and without the comfort of full explanation. Warren Beatty plays Frady with a rumpled intelligence and a physical confidence that the film systematically undermines. A man who believes that knowing the truth about a system is sufficient protection against what the system does to people who know too much about it, and who discovers, across 92 minutes of mounting dread, that this belief is the most dangerous thing about him. The moment that defines the parallax view is the recruitment film. A sequence in which Frady, having infiltrated the Parallax Corporation's psychological testing process, sits in a darkened room watching a montage of images designed to identify and amplify the specific psychological vulnerabilities that make a person useful to the organization. Pakula shoots Frady watching the screen and the screen itself in alternating cuts. And the audience, positioned between the two, understands that they are also watching the recruitment film and also being assessed by it, and that their own responses to what they are seeing are data that the film is collecting without their consent. Pakula made the parallax view between the assassination of Robert Kennedy and the resignation of Richard Nixon in a cultural moment so saturated with evidence of institutional corruption that the film's premise required no suspension of disbelief from its audience, and received none. It ends without resolution, without exposure, without the institutional accountability that the journalism film normally delivers as its generic promise. The system remains intact. The journalist does not. The final scene is a press conference. The official explanation is provided. Nobody in the room challenges it. The film cuts to black and does not return. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, released in 1978, directed by Philip Kaufman, and representing one of the rare instances in cinema history where a remake surpasses its source material so completely and so honestly that the conversation about which version to recommend has been settled for 40 years, without producing significant dissent among the people who have seen both. Matthew Bennell is a San Francisco public health inspector, a man whose professional function is identifying contaminants in the urban environment, and whose personal life is populated by the specific constellation of late 70s San Francisco types that the film assembles with an anthropological affection before beginning, with considerable patience, to replace them. The replacement is botanical in origin. Seed pods of extraterrestrial provenance producing perfect physical duplicates of human beings during sleep. The originals dissolving. The duplicates retaining memory and behavior patterns while losing whatever it is that the original possessed that the film declines to name precisely because naming it would reduce it to a quantity that the film correctly understands is not a quantity. Donald Sutherland plays Bennell with a paranoia that escalates so gradually and so naturally that the audience cannot locate the moment they stopped being certain he was wrong. Jeff Goldblum and Veronica Cartwright provide the ensemble's emotional texture, people processing an impossible situation through the specific frameworks their personalities have available, which turn out to be inadequate in ways that are both completely logical and completely devastating. The moment that defines Invasion of the Body Snatchers is its final image. An image that arrives without score, without dialogue, without any of the conventional signals that a film uses to prepare its audience for what it is about to show them, and that has been described by everyone who encountered it unprepared as the most disturbing final shot in American science fiction cinema. It will not be described here. It needs to be seen without preparation to do what it does. What it does is permanent. Kaufman shot San Francisco with a documentary naturalism that makes the city's actual geography and population feel complicit in the replacement rather than victimized by it, as though the process had been underway long enough before the film begins that the city itself has already forgotten what it was replacing. The 1956 original used the pod people as a McCarthy-era allegory for communist infiltration. The 1978 remake uses them as something considerably less politically specific and considerably more existentially accurate. A description of what it feels like to look at the people around you and understand, without being able to prove it, that something has changed in them, that the change itself has made it impossible to discuss. Capricorn 1, released in 1977, directed by Peter Hyams, arriving in American cinemas 2 years after the Church Committee hearings had confirmed for the American public that their government was capable of conducting operations of a scale and a duplicity that the pre-Watergate civic imagination had genuinely not been prepared to accommodate, and that the post-Watergate civic imagination was perhaps too exhausted to be surprised by anymore. The Mars mission is failing before it launches. A life support system malfunction discovered 72 hours before liftoff cannot be repaired in time. And the program's director, played by Hal Holbrook, with the specific quality of a man who has made a catastrophic decision and has chosen to experience it as a management challenge rather than a moral crisis, has concluded that the alternative to faking the landing is the termination of the entire space program and the end of American prestige at a moment when American prestige cannot afford another public failure. 3 astronauts, James Brolin, Sam Waterston, and O.J. Simpson, whose presence in the cast the film's subsequent cultural life has made increasingly difficult to discuss without distraction, are removed from the rocket before launch, transported to a desert facility, and informed they will be performing their Mars landing on a soundstage while the actual capsule completes its unmanned orbit. They comply, under the specific duress of men who have been shown photographs of their families and reminded of their continued vulnerability. A journalist played by Elliot Gould, investigating an anomaly that a NASA technician mentioned before disappearing, begins pulling a thread that the people who constructed the deception had not fully secured. The moment that defines Capricorn 1 is the realization, arriving midway through the film with the cold clarity of arithmetic rather than revelation, that the conspiracy's internal logic requires the astronauts to die on re-entry, regardless of what they agreed to on the soundstage. Dead men cannot reconsider their cooperation. Holbrook delivers this logic to his subordinate with the calm of a man explaining a spreadsheet. The subordinate does not object. The film does not editorialize. It simply lets the math speak. Capricorn 1 was released 3 years after the Nixon resignation, and 8 years after the Apollo 11 landing. At a cultural moment when the American public's capacity to believe that their institutions were capable of large-scale coordinated deception had been permanently recalibrated by recent events. Hyams has said in interviews that he wanted to make a film about what happens when the gap between what a government needs its citizens to believe and what is actually true becomes large enough that maintaining the belief requires active management. Watergate had demonstrated that the gap existed. Capricorn 1 asked what it looked like from the inside. 10 films. Time in the 1970s. And the decade still has not run out of things to say. Look at what these 10 films were actually doing. Episodes in the 1970s. The questions keep coming. So do we. Subscribe. Next time, somewhere new. We will see you there.